Friday, May 29, 2026, and do not expect baseball in 2027. We have some very bad news for baseball fans. On Thursday, the Major League Baseball owners presented the Major League Baseball Players Association with a proposal that essentially institutes a hard salary cap on all 30 Major League teams. What this will do, it will force teams to uh, spend a minimum on a player budget and associated cost, but it will also set a ceiling. What is troubling here is that the proposed ceiling and the proposed floor aren't that far apart. This is going to cause a great deal of deformation in the current structure among all the clubs. It will force teams like the Tampa Bay Rays and the Miami Marlins to spend much more money than they currently are. It would also force teams like the New York Mets to cut their current payroll by perhaps up to one third. The Los Angeles Dodgers may be looking at a 40% haircut, a forced reduction from their 2026 player budget. And that's not before taking into account that you've got contracts that have yet to go into force at a higher level, and they take effect in 2027. I don't expect those contracts to ever be paid. The reason why I say there will not be any baseball in 2027 is because the salary cap structure and the way this is being approached by the owners is eerily reminiscent of how the National Hockey League crammed down a hard salary cap on its players' union in 2005. The proposals were made back in 2003 by the NHL owners. And it's a case where there was a lockout instituted. This was not a player initiated strike, they were locked out by the owners uh, before training camp in 2004. And there was no 2004 2005 NHL season. The entire season was wiped out. There was no agreement. There were some negotiations as late as February of 2005. When those fell apart, the season was wiped out. And I think the same thing is going to happen in Major League Baseball. Here's the timeline. The current players' agreement expires in March 2027. And traditionally, you don't really get people to negotiate seriously until there's some risk of loss, either in terms of revenues for the owners or revenues, meaning salaries, for the ball players. The current agreement expiring during spring training 27. You've got to expect that negotiations would ramp up uh, really not for another 6 months. I would be very surprised if there's any movement um, because this is really going to be a serious change. It also is a type of change that is not going to affect every owner equally. Here's a sticking point that I think will cause problems among the 30 owners is that you will have owners forced to share their local TV and radio revenues. Not all markets are equal. Markets like New York and Los Angeles, they each support two teams. They generate much more local revenue, whereas you've got about 6 to 8 Major League Baseball teams where their local TV packages are being run by Major League Baseball right now because of the bankruptcy of some of the regional sports networks. There are some small markets in Major League Baseball that just don't have that much of a reach within a certain metropolitan area, and I'll name a few of them. Milwaukee is one. Cincinnati is another. These are not, by the way, not necessarily low spending teams. Both Milwaukee and Cincinnati spent about 130 to 140 million on player salaries, which, given the size of their market, I think is rather admirable. Then you have teams like Tampa and Miami, which are they are major markets, but in terms of Major League Baseball generating revenue, aren't that big. And you've seen it really for an entire generation since those markets entered Major League Baseball. They have not been high attendance markets. The Rays have never drawn in their abomination of a ballpark. It was actually built as an indoor arena for the NHL before the Tampa Bay Devil Rays joined in 1998. The Miami Marlins have not drawn despite now having the Dome Stadium. Ironically, there's a lot of interest in Major League Baseball in Miami. It just has never translated to the Marlins. If you go back 40 years, if you travel to Miami, you could get on TV and radio every game of the New York teams, as well as many of the Chicago Cubs and Chicago White Sox games. Uh, that's courtesy of the superstation WGN in Chicago. Uh, and, and going back to the 70s, most of the country could actually watch on cable the Braves on what is still called TBS, part of the Turner Network. Low market revenue teams would be in a situation where they would be able to share in the local revenues of much higher revenue producing teams. This means that the interest of Miami and Tampa will not be the same as the interest of, say, the Dodgers or the Mets or the Boston Red Sox, the traditional high revenue markets that also spend. So you've got teams that for years have been subsidizing other franchises that, in terms of just player salaries, have been spending 3 to 4 times the amount. The Dodgers spent 410 million last year, whereas teams like Miami spent less than 80 million. And look at the standings. There is not a tremendous disparity in the standings. Yes, the Dodgers are a two-time repeat world champion, but you're not seeing a case where Miami is winning 40 games. They were actually close to being in contention for a playoff spot last season, which I think is admirable. I think spending wisely is a great thing. When you've got the dislocation of high revenue teams that are spending in excess of 250 million, they will have to cram down, uh, either cutting guaranteed contracts or trading contracts. That's the sticking point. That's what the National Hockey League did. They crammed down a mandatory haircut of somewhere close to 70% on existing contracts to force the union to come back to the table and finally to resume operations in 2005. How do you have teams like the Dodgers and the Mets and the Red Sox cut payroll by 30 to 40%? Um, you could trade players theoretically, but there may not be that many teams that could absorb those contracts and then remain compliant within the range of, under the current proposal, the range would be a floor of about 170 million, a ceiling of 240. And within that, if you just trade a few players, you could go from the ceiling to the floor pretty quickly. And that also troubles me because you might be locked into contracts where you either can't move a contract that you want to because you need to be compliant to get under the cap, or you can't trade a player because you need his salary to count against the cap. Of course, the details would be ironed out. These are just basic proposals. So, how it works in reality, we are far away from dealing with that. But the ramifications of this are such. I don't think the owners will be united. The players have to be thinking that the NHL precedent would force them to take a pay cut on existing, already negotiated contracts. And I think it's troubling just from the sense of these are contracts that were already negotiated in good faith uh, between players who have often made decisions with long term contracts. They have made a commitment and they're not getting it back. Clearly, you can be traded. That's part of the business. Uh, but a situation where you make concessions, perhaps on a contract because of the number of years, uh, and then you're simply not getting the money that you're expecting to get. This is not the National Football League where contracts aren't guaranteed. These contracts are guaranteed. These players negotiated the contracts. It was a good faith negotiation. And I think that we're looking at a haircut. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but you're looking at a situation where a Shohei Ohtani, a Juan Soto, Yoshiburo Yamamoto, uh, they're all making, well, Yamamoto's making about 35 million, Soto's making over 50 million, so is Ohtani. Even these players are looking at taking a haircut on those type of deals so that some team can fit them under that team's cap. Because of all these issues, I don't expect that you will get a full 162 game schedule in 2027. As a matter of fact, there are some teams, if you think about it, if you can save 300 million in player salaries by mothballing the entire season, you might actually go from being cash flow negative to cash flow positive just by not paying out those salaries. There are National Hockey League teams back in '05 with their lockout and missed season that actually lost far less money by not paying any of the players, despite the fact that their revenues went to zero. That may happen here. Major League Baseball has some profitable teams. Would you believe that there are teams that are net cash flow positive and they spend close to the bottom? Whereas, according to reported figures, teams like the Mets are actually cash flow negative because they blew out their player budget, where their player budget is actually exceeding their revenues. Think about that. And then consider that the Tampa Bay Rays spent last year playing in a minor league stadium and averaged less than 11,000 fans a game, whereas the New York Mets averaged was somewhere north of 35,000 fans a game, if you believe the reported figures. And that's another sticking point. That's an asterisk that you have to use on all of these figures. You see the ball games just as I do, and a lot of times these fans are coming to the ballpark disguised as empty seats. The tickets might have been sold, but ask yourself this: would you pay 75 bucks or 100 bucks or more and then not use the ticket? In the event, I am very pessimistic for 2027's Major League Baseball schedule. I think you'll miss an entire year. And I think that that's going to happen because it actually makes economic sense for too many of these owners. The players are going to get screwed. Some of these big contracts that you've seen over the past year or two, those players are not going to ever get that money. And that might be a reason why you've heard that recent contracts in the last two free agent years involve these huge signing bonuses where players knew they might lose an entire year. So they're going to get the money now by means of a signing bonus. By the way, that would be something that you have to watch out for. How would player salaries be calculated? Not in real dollars, but in terms of how you calculate compliance against the cap. Uh, Payouts to players and cap charges are not the same in the National Hockey League. They're not the same in the NBA, and expect that to also occur in Major League Baseball. The news is very bad for baseball fans. Enjoy 2026. I am Eric Dixon, and you've been watching the Capital Shrugged podcast. Thank you.